I'm known as Joe, and I'll be the narrator of this story. If you're new to our channel, please subscribe to help us reach our goal of 1,000 subscribers. A 10-year-old boy walks straight past an oblivious, laughing police officer. He approaches the most terrifying man he's ever seen, the president of a veteran motorcycle club. The boy says nothing. He just jams a crumpled napkin into the biker's massive gloved hand and disappears. The biker, Grizz, opens it. The note has just 3 words: "Help, man in van." Marcus was 10 years old, but his eyes were ancient. They were the color of the bruised Ohio sky that hung heavy over the town of Warren, windows that had seen too much industry die and too much hope curdle. He was the sole caregiver for his grandmother, Nana Rose, a woman whose pride was as fierce as the silicosis that rattled in her chest, a dusty souvenir from the textile mills that had long since shut their doors. Marcus navigated the cracked sidewalks of their neighborhood, not as a boy, but as a small, determined ghost, his shoulders already bowed by a weight that would break most men. He was the man of the house, a house held together by expired medical bills and quiet prayers. Nana Rose's world had shrunk to a single threadbare armchair facing a window, her oxygen tank hissing beside her like a mechanical snake. The medical debt was a mountain, an immovable object of collection notices and threatening red ink that Marcus would fish out of the mailbox before she could see them. He knew, in a way no child should, that they were one bad cough away from absolute ruin. Before we dive deeper into their story, I have to ask, where are you watching this from? Drop your city and country in the comments right now. Let us know what corner of the world you are in as we watch this unfold in the American Rust Belt. Warren, Ohio was a carcass of the American dream. The great steel mills stood silent on the horizon, their smokestacks looking like forgotten cannons aimed at a sky that no longer cared. The air smelled of cold rain and rust. This was a town built on grit and fire, and both had been extinguished, leaving behind a population that had learned to survive on low expectation and bitter memories. Hope was a foreign currency here, something you saw in old movies, but never held in your own hand. The storefronts on Main Street were boarded up, their plywood panels like tombstones for small businesses that had failed one by one. Their small apartment was on the third floor of a walk-up that smelled of damp drywall and boiled cabbage. The radiator in the living room barely managed to fight back the penetrating autumn chill, forcing Nana Rose to stay buried under a pile of mismatched blankets. The most terrifying object in their life was the bright orange eviction notice stapled to their door. Its legal language, a death sentence Marcus could not fully read, but understood perfectly. It gave them 7 days. 7 days before the lock was changed, and the cold outside became the cold inside. This constant, buzzing fear was the soundtrack to Marcus's life. His only sanctuary, if you could call it that, was the Junction Diner. It was a classic 24-hour joint off the state highway, a place where the neon sign flickered and the coffee was perpetually burnt. The Formica countertop was worn smooth by the elbows of truckers and third-shift workers. Marcus would sometimes stop there on his way back from the pharmacy, pretending to look for someone. Marge, a waitress with a gravelly voice and a heart that had not yet hardened, would sometimes slip him a bag with a leftover biscuit or a cup of lukewarm chocolate, never saying a word, a silent conspiracy against the hunger that gnawed at him. His daily routine was a rigid loop of responsibility. He would wake before dawn, check the levels on Nana Rose's oxygen concentrator, and lay out her pills. He would go to school, his mind not on subtraction or spelling, but on whether the electricity would still be on when he got home. He would sit in class, invisible, the teachers mistaking his quiet terror for a lack of interest. After school, he would run to the pharmacy, his small legs aching, to pick up prescriptions he paid for with crumpled dollars he had earned sorting bottles behind a local bar. He was profoundly alone. The other kids in his class talked about video games and baseball cards. Marcus worried about Medicare gaps and the price of antibiotics. He had no friends his own age. He was an old man trapped in a small, underfed body. He moved through the world with a forced invisibility, learning that if he made no noise and asked for nothing, the harsher elements of the world might just pass him by. He was an island of silent, desperate responsibility, and the tide was rising fast, threatening to swallow him and the grandmother who was his entire world. The truly remarkable thing about Marcus was his lack of bitterness. The world had given him every reason to become hard, to become cynical, to match the grayness of his city with a grayness in his own soul, but he had not. His pure purity was not innocence. He was not naive. He saw the harshness of the world with painful clarity. His goodness was a stubborn act of defiance. He still believed, with a desperate sincerity, that if he just did the right thing, if he just took care of his Nana, somehow, the universe would eventually balance the scales. The sounds of his world were not the sounds of childhood. They were the hiss of the oxygen machine, the painful, shallow coughs from the next room in the middle of the night, and the rumble of heavy trucks on the highway, a reminder of a world that was moving on without them. He would stand at the window, not looking at the dying town, but at the sky, wondering if help was something that actually existed, or if it was just a word people used in stories. He felt the desperation closing in, the walls of their tiny apartment feeling smaller every single day. He was the perfect victim, small, quiet, poor, and utterly without protection. He was the boy who could disappear, and no one would even notice for days. The system had failed him before he even knew how to ask it for help. But Marcus had one quality the world had not yet beaten out of him. He was an observer. He watched everyone. He saw the details the busy, indifferent adults missed. And he was beginning to notice a new terrifying pattern in his broken-to-down town. He was noticing the van. The cold afternoon was shattered by a sound that did not belong in a dying town. It was not a single engine, but a rolling tectonic thunder that vibrated in Marcus's chest. It was the sound of heavy American steel, a deep-throated roar that announced an arrival. People on the street froze, their heads turning in unison. The sound was judgment itself, and it was coming for Warren. It was a wave of noise that washed over the cracked pavement and rattled the windows of the boarded-up shops, a promise of power in a place that had none. This was not a hobby. It was an occupation. They appeared at the edge of town, a river of chrome and black leather flooding the main thoroughfare. They rode in a tight, disciplined formation, 2 by 2, a phalanx of Harley-Davidson road glides and street glides that seemed to stretch for a mile. This was the Iron Sentinels Veteran Motorcycle Club. Their cuts were adorned with patches that told stories, forgotten wars, and hard miles. They were not weekend warriors. They were a disciplined, grizzled army of men who had traded one uniform for another, and their loyalty was not to a flag, but to the patch on their backs. At their head rode Grizz, the club president. He was a man built on the scale of a mountain, with a beard that was more gray than black, braided and decorated with small silver skulls. His arms, visible beneath his rolled-up flannel, were a tapestry of ink detailing his service in the Marine Corps, from Fallujah to Kandahar. When he dismounted at the Junction Diner, the earth seemed to sigh under his weight. His face was a mask of impassive granite, his eyes hidden behind dark sunglasses, seeing everything, revealing nothing. He was the most dangerous-looking man Marcus had ever seen. The patrons inside the diner instinctively moved away from the windows. Marge, the waitress, dropped a plate, the sound of it shattering lost in the rumble of idling engines. Fear, thick and metallic, filled the air. These were not men you called the police on, because you suspected, deep down, that the police were afraid of them too. They were an outlaw element, a variable that the broken system of Warren could not compute. They represented a different kind of law, one that was older and more final. The town held its collective breath, waiting to see what this invasion meant. Grizz did not enter the diner. He stood by his bike, cracking his knuckles, his back aching from the long ride. He hated these dying towns. They reminded him too much of the promises his country had broken, both to these communities and to the men he led. He looked at the fearful faces peering at him from behind the glass and felt the familiar sting of judgment. The world saw him as a monster, a brute. He was weary of it, weary of being the boogeyman, but he understood his role. Sometimes he knew you needed a monster to keep the real ones at bay. At that exact moment, another vehicle pulled up across the street, silent and unremarkable. It was a white work van, a newer model Ford Transit, its side panels empty of any company logo, its rear windows blacked out with cheap tint. It parked with insidious quietness, its engine barely making a sound as it cut off. It sat directly across from the diner, aimed perfectly at the small elementary school playground just down the block, where the last few children were finishing a game of tag, their bright jackets a splash of color in the gray landscape. The driver's side door did not open. The van just sat, waiting, watching. A man was visible inside, but his features were obscured by the angle of the sun and the dirty windshield. He was a shadow, a patient predator who understood the rhythms of a small town. This was Mr. Fitch. He was not loud like the bikers. He was not threatening threatening in his appearance. He was something far worse. He was invisible, hiding in plain sight, a cancer that had gone unnoticed. His stillness was 1,000 times more terrifying than the roar of the motorcycles. Marcus, standing in the shadows of the diner's entryway, felt his blood turn to ice. He knew that van. He had seen it for weeks. Always near the school, always near the park, always just watching. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic bird in a tiny cage. He had told Mr. Evans, the principal. He had tried to tell Officer Riley. He knew, with the chilling certainty of the truly vulnerable, that this man was a wolf and the children on that playground were lambs. And he knew that no one believed him. His gaze darted inside the diner. He saw him, Officer Riley, his paunch hanging over his duty belt, sitting at the counter, his back to the window. He was laughing, his mouth full of donut, sharing a joke with Marge. He was safe, warm, and completely, utterly useless. The one man in town paid to protect, to serve, to listen to a terrified boy, was facing the wrong way. The badge on his chest was nothing more than a shiny piece of metal, a hollow symbol of a system that was fat, blind, and broken. It was in that second that Marcus's world fractured. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. The safe people would not help. The entire structure of his world principles, police, adults, was a lie. He looked at the oblivious cop laughing, then looked back across the street at the silent waiting van. Then, his eyes moved to the giant, terrifying man in the leather vest. Grizz, the monster, the scary man, the outlaw. In that moment of absolute despair, Marcus understood. He had only one option left. His terror for the children on that playground suddenly eclipsed his fear for himself. This was the purity of Marcus. His own suffering had not made him selfish. It had made him empathetic. He could not stand by and watch the wolf circle the flock. He fumbled in his pocket and pulled out the only two things he owned, a crumpled napkin Marge had given him and a broken red crayon he'd had found on the sidewalk. His hands were shaking so violently he could barely write, but he forced the letters onto the paper. He scrawled 4 words, pressing the crayon so hard it snapped. Help, man in white van. He takes kids. It was not a plea. It was a report. It was the desperate act of a field agent whose command had gone dark, making one last broadcast to anyone who might be listening. He folded the napkin, his small hand crushing it into a tiny, desperate square. He looked at the bikers, his protectors, and he knew what he had to do. He pushed open the diner door. The small bell above it tinkled, a sound completely lost in the thrum of the Harleys. He stepped out onto the wet pavement. He felt tiny, a mouse walking into a den of lions. He walked past the idling bikes, past the leering gazes of the other club members, who watched him with curiosity. He walked directly toward the mountain of a man who stood at the front. He walked right up to Grizz, who was still staring down the town, and stopped. Grizz looked down. His first thought was annoyance. A beggar, a street kid looking for a handout. He was about to wave him away, to tell him to get lost. But Marcus did not hold out his hand to beg. He looked up, his ancient eyes locking with the bikers. There was no fear in them now, just a terrible, profound, and urgent certainty. It was an appeal from one soul to another, a look that bypassed all the rules of society. Marcus, trembling with adrenaline, jammed the crumpled napkin into the palm of Grizz's black leather glove. He did not say a word. He did not have to. The look he gave the biker said everything. It said, I know you are not who they think you are. I know you see what they do not. Please. It was an act of impossible, beautiful, and utterly desperate faith. It was the purest act of courage the Iron Sentinels had seen in a decade. Then he was gone. Before Grizz could even react, before he could unclench his fist to see what had been pressed into it, Marcus turned and bolted. He ran not toward his home, but into the nearest alley, disappearing between the brick buildings like a wisp of smoke. He had delivered the message. He had lit the fuse. He had done his part. The rest was up to the monsters. Grizz stood there, stunned, the rumble of his own bike vibrating in his bones, feeling the small, warm square of paper in his giant, calloused hand. Grizz stood frozen for a beat. The engines of his club idled behind him, a mechanical chorus waiting for its conductor. He unclenched his gloved fist. Napkin was damp, the red crayon smudged by the boy's terrified sweat. Help, man in white van. He takes kids. The words were simple, blunt, a raw signal of distress. Grizz had seen this kind of terror before, not in bars or on highways, but in the Sunni Triangle, in the eyes of civilians trapped between forces they could not control. It was the look of the truly hopeless, a look that never lied. It was pure, unadulterated fear, and it had just been placed directly into his hand. He looked up, his gaze haze sweeping the scene. He saw Officer Riley, still visible through the diner window, wiping his mouth with a napkin, oblivious. He saw the empty alley where the small boy had vanished. Marcus had not run to the cop. He had run past the cop, past the official, sanctioned symbol of safety and law, to hand a desperate plea to a man society had labeled a menace. Grizz understood the implication immediately. The system was not just slow, it was broken. The boy knew it, and by handing Grizz that note, the boy had just made the Iron Sentinels the only system that mattered. His vice president, Preacher, moved to his side. Preacher was wiry, older, a Vietnam veteran from the 101st Airborne. He earned his name not for his faith, but for the eloquent, final-sounding sermons he was known to give to their enemies. He glanced at the note in Grizz's hand, his eyes narrowing. "Trouble, press?" Grizz just grunted, crushing the napkin in his fist. He nodded almost imperceptibly across the street, at the white van, which was still sitting there, patient as a spider. "We're watching," Grizz said. It was not a suggestion, it was a verdict. The two men, a wall of leather and patches, turned their full attention to the van. They did not move toward their bikes. They stood, two statues of judgment, their presence a heavy, unspoken weight on the atmosphere of the street. They were invisible to Officer Riley, who was now paying his check, but they were acutely visible to the man in the van. A minute passed, then another. The man in the van, Mr. Fitch, clearly felt the scrutiny. He had been comfortable when the only threat was a bumbling local cop, but two high-ranking VMC members staring directly at him was a different calculation. The van's engine suddenly turned over, a quiet, unimpressive sound in the afternoon air. The van pulled away from the curb, not quickly, but not casually either. It was the unmistakable movement of a man trying not to look like he was running. Grizz did not run. He swung a massive leg over his Harley, the heavy machine groaning under his weight. Preacher mounted his own. "Club stays," Grizz ordered the sergeant-at-arms. "We go quiet." He and Preacher flipped their visors down, and without another word, the two bikes peeled away from the diner, their engines kept at a low, predatory rumble, giving the van 100 yards of space. They melted into Warren's sparse afternoon traffic, two sharks trailing a contaminated vessel. They tailed the van for 10 minutes, deeper into the crumbling residential neighborhoods where the houses were cheap and the fences were broken. Fitch drove in a lazy, meandering loop, as if checking his mirrors, as if trying to convince himself he was not being followed. Then he stopped. He pulled up next to a different park, this one smaller, overgrown with weeds. A single girl, no older than 8, was walking home alone, her pink backpack bouncing. Fitch rolled down his passenger window. Grizz and Preacher idled their bikes at the corner, partially hidden by a rusted-out bus stop shelter, and watched. They were too far to hear, but the body language was undeniable. Mr. Fitch leaned across the passenger seat. Grizz saw it, and his blood thickened into ice. A small brown and white puppy, squirming in Fitch's large hand. He was holding it out the window, trying to get the little girl to come closer. The girl stopped. She looked at the puppy, her caution warring with her innate childhood desire. She took one step toward the van, then another. Grizz felt a cold rage, a familiar combat fury, begin to burn in his stomach. This was the mechanism. This was how the wolf hunted. He was watching the trap being set, the bait being offered, and the innocence of a child being weaponized against itself. Grizz did not wait for a third step. He rolled his wrist, just a fraction. The sudden, explosive crack of his modified Harley engine shattered the quiet street like a gunshot. It was a sound of pure, mechanical violence. He and Preacher rolled their bikes slowly out from behind the bus stop, moving to block the road, placing their heavy machines directly between the van and the little girl. They did not rev their engines again. They did not yell. They simply appeared, two giants of chrome and leather, their sunglass-covered faces aimed directly at Fitch. They were an uncrossable line. The little girl, startled by the noise, jumped back and ran, disappearing down a side street toward her home. Mr. Fitch's reaction was instantaneous. The puppy was yanked back inside. The passenger window powered up. Fitch did not look at them. He slammed the van into drive, the tires squealing on the pavement as he cranked the wheel, jumping the curb to get around their bikes. He sped off, his vehicle fishtailing before finding traction, fleeing the scene with a panic that was a clear and total admission of guilt. The bikers had their confirmation. The boy was right. He spooked Preacher, sighed, his voice flat over the rumble of their idling bikes. "He's running for his hole." Grizz nodded, the rage inside him now cold and focused. "We stay on him." The chase was on, but it was not a chase. It was a pursuit. They followed the white van as it left the residential streets, and headed toward the river, toward the industrial graveyard of Warren. They crossed the old steel bridge, the Mahoning River flowing brown and sluggish below them, a dumping ground for a century of failed industry. This was the part of town the maps ignored. This was where the city had died first. The warehouse district was a maze of abandoned factories and decaying depots. The streets were more pothole than pavement. This was a place of ghosts. A place where no one came, a place where the police never patrolled because there was nothing left to protect. It was the perfect place to hide a terrible secret. Fitch's van swerved into a narrow access road between two massive windowless brick buildings and disappeared. Grizz and Preacher cut their engines, letting the sudden oppressive silence of the area wash over them. The only sound was the faint ticking of their cooling exhaust pipes. They dismounted, their heavy boots crunching on gravel and broken glass. "Stay sharp," Grizz muttered, pulling a heavy maglite from his saddlebag. It was not just a flashlight. It was a milled aluminum baton. They moved with the practiced, silent steps of infantrymen clearing a building. They rounded the corner of the brick monolith and saw it. The white van was parked hastily, its side door almost touching a long blue shipping container. It was one of dozens, stacked in a chaotic jumble in a fenced-off yard, but this was the one the van was next to. It was locked from the outside with a heavy, brand-new padlock. Preacher put a hand up, signaling for silence. Grizz froze. They listened. At first, nothing. Just the wind whistling through the thousands of broken windows of the factory above them. Then they heard it. It was so faint, Grizz almost thought he had imagined it. It was a whimper, a high-pitched, terrified sound, quickly muffled, as if by a hand. It was the sound of a child. It was coming from inside the steel box. Then they heard it again, a different, weaker sound. The little boy, Marcus, had been right. It was plural. A cold, professional calm settled over Grizz. The rage was still there, but it was focused now, sharpened to a razor's edge. This was not a predator on the hunt. This was a lair. This was a nest. The boy's note had not been a warning about a potential threat. It had been an alarm about an active, ongoing atrocity. The system had not just failed. It had been negligent to the point of complicity. Officer Riley was laughing over coffee and donuts, while children were crying in a steel box just 2 miles away. The full, monstrous scale of the truth settled on Grizz's shoulders, and it was a weight he accepted. Preacher looked at Grizz, his eyes dark and hard. "Broken Shield," he said. It was not a question. It was the activation of their most sacred and most terrifying pact. The Broken Shield protocol was reserved for this. Not for bar fights, not for turf wars, but for the innocent, the defenseless. It was the club's ultimate binding oath. When a child was in danger, all rules were suspended. All debts were called in. All chapters rode. It was a declaration of total righteous war, and it had not been activated in 5 years. Grizz pulled his smartphone from his vest pocket. His massive, tattooed thumb moved over the screen. He did not call 911. The police had already failed. He was calling in a force that he knew, with absolute certainty, would not. He opened the secure communication channel to his national chapter. His voice was not a yell. It was a low, guttural growl, a sound of controlled thunder, a promise of the storm to come. He was the man who commanded an army of outlaws, and he was giving the order to march. "This is Grizz, national president." His voice was flat, devoid of emotion, which made it all the more terrifying. "I am invoking Broken Shield protocol, effective immediately." He gave the coordinates. "Warren, Ohio, Mahoning River Warehouse District. We have multiple children. Active situation. Hostile confirmed." He paused, his voice dropping, becoming lethally cold. "I want every sentinel who can hear my voice. I want Ohio. I want Pennsylvania. I want Michigan. I want everyone. Bring everyone. Now." He did not need to say more. He did not need to threaten or cajole. He had spoken the words. The mechanism was engaged. He hung up. Across 3 states, cell phones buzzed and chirped. In garages, in bars, at construction sites, and in VFW posts, men in leather vests stopped what they were doing. They looked at their screens. They saw the 2 words, Broken Shield. They saw the location. Husbands kissed their wives goodbye. Men walked off their jobs. Engines roared to life. A tide of steel and vengeance began to move, converging from all directions. A flood of righteous anger aimed like a spear at the black, rotten heart of Warren, Ohio. The system had failed. The true judges were now on their way. Officer Riley was done. His shift was over. the paperwork filed. He was thinking about a cold beer and the frozen lasagna waiting in his freezer. He sat in his cruiser outside the Junction Diner, the engine idling, letting the weak heater chase the last of the damp chill from his bones. He was tired. Tired of the town, tired of the paperwork, tired of kids like Marcus making up stories. He was a man counting the days to his pension, a man who had long ago traded vigilance for routine. The system he represented was just as tired as he was, running on fumes and apathy. It started not as a sound, but as a vibration. The half-full styrofoam coffee cup in his holder began to tremble, its plastic lid buzzing against the rim. Riley frowned, thinking it was a heavy rig, passing on the highway, maybe an oversized load from the one factory still operating. But the vibration did not fade. It grew. It became a low, persistent hum, a note so deep he felt it in his teeth. It was the sound of the horizon itself, waking up and growling. This was not a truck. This was not a train. This was something else. This was wrong. Then the sound arrived. It was not a roar. It was a tectonic event. It was the sound of a controlled earthquake, a rolling thunder that seemed to come from all directions at once, swallowing the quiet dusk of Warren, Ohio. It shook the windows of the diner. It made the streetlights flicker. Marge ran to the diner door, her face pale, looking up at the sky as if expecting a military attack. Across the city, people stopped. Conversations died. Televisions were muted. The entire town froze, united in a new sudden terror. What was coming for them? They appeared on State Route 422, cresting the hill by the old high school. It was not a gang, it was a column. The headlights broke through the deepening red sunset, 1,000 points of light, a constellation of judgment, moving at exactly the speed limit. They were a river, a torrent of polished chrome and black steel that flowed into the dying city. They were 2 by 2, a disciplined, endless phalanx of heavy American motorcycles. They were the Iron Sentinels, and they had brought their friends. They were 500 strong, 500 men who had answered the call. The sheer scale of it was paralyzing. This was not a ride. It was an occupation. The flood of engines split at the town square, the column dividing with military precision, flanking the courthouse, flowing down the side streets. They were not loud for the sake of being loud. They were loud because they were many, their engines a unified chorus of mechanical fury. Neighbors, the same ones who ignored Nana Rose's plight, now peered from behind their curtains, their phones out, their hands shaking. They saw an army. They saw the end of their quiet, broken world. Officer Riley's blood turned to ice water. His hand fumbled for his radio, his voice cracking, the professional calm of a lifetime on the force shattering an instant. Dispatch, dispatch, I have a 10 to 31. No. It's a god I don't know, he stammered. I have a massive gathering. Motorcycle clubs, hundreds, maybe 500. They are moving with purpose. The dispatcher's voice was tinny, frantic. Purpose toward. Where really? What is the target? Riley watched the last of the column pass. They are all heading for the river, for the warehouse district. He slammed the cruiser into gear, his mind screaming. This was it. A drug war. A gang massacre. The worst case scenario for his tiny, underfunded department. He had 6 officers on duty, 6 against 500 hardened veterans. His siren shrieked to life, a pathetic singular wail against the overwhelming thunder of the bikes. He floored the gas pedal, the old Crown Victoria roaring in protest, racing toward the industrial sector, his heart hammering against his Kevlar vest. He was not racing to stop them. He knew he could not. He was racing to witness the aftermath, to count the bodies. 2 other cruisers fell in behind him, their blue and red lights painting the decaying buildings as they sped past. They were terrified. They were cops in a town where the worst crime was usually a stolen lawnmower, and they were now heading into what they assumed was a small war. They gripped their shotguns, their knuckles white. The dispatcher's voice was frantic in their ears, demanding updates they could not give. They were the system, the official protectors, and they were late, outgunned, and completely, utterly irrelevant to the justice that was about to be delivered. As they neared the warehouse district, the roar of the engines suddenly died. It did not fade. It was cut. All at once. 500 heavy engines, silenced by a single, unspoken command. The sudden, oppressive quiet was more terrifying than the noise. It was the silence of a predator that has cornered its prey. It was the silence of absolute control. Riley's cruiser skidded around the final corner, his headlights cutting into the darkness of the factory yard, and he slammed on his brakes. His jaw fell open. It was not a riot. It was not chaos. It was a fortress. The 500 motorcycles were parked in perfect concentric rings, forming an impenetrable barrier around the center of the yard. Their headlights were all turned on, all aimed inward, creating a blazing arena of light focused on a single blue shipping container. And standing in front of the bikes, shoulder to shoulder, forming a solid, unbreachable wall of leather and denim, were the bikers. They were silent. They were statues, and they were all facing in, their backs to the police. Riley and the other two officers got out of their cars, leaving the doors open. The wail of their sirens died with a pathetic gulp. Riley fumbled with his flashlight, its weak yellow beam useless against the stadium of light the bikes had created. "Warren PD," he shouted, his voice sounding small and weak. "What is the meaning of this? Disperse immediately." Not a single man turned, not a single head moved. They simply stood, a silent army of guardians, containing the horror they had found. They did not acknowledge the police. They did not need to. Inside the perimeter, hidden from the police by the wall of men, Mr. Fitch was on his knees, his hands zip-tied. His van door was open, the small, whimpering puppy now cowering in the cab. But Fitch was not the prize. He was just the hired help. Next to him, bound to a steel girder, his face a mask of abject terror and disbelief, was the true cancer. Principal Evans, the director of the elementary school, the man who had access to the files of every vulnerable child in the district, the man who had dismissed Marcus's fears as imagination. Evans had been the mastermind. He was the one who identified the targets. Children from broken homes, children in poverty, children like Marcus, whose grandmother was sick and whose absence would barely register on the system's blotted radar. He was the one who used his position of sacred trust to feed his monstrous appetite, using the bumbling Fitch as his collector. He had believed he was invisible, protected by his title, by his desk, by the very system that Officer Riley represented. He was untouchable. Until now, he had heard the engines. He had thought it was a local club, maybe coming to dump stolen parts. Then the sound had grown, and the light had flooded the yard, and the door to his office had been ripped from its hinges by Grizz himself. The moment Evans saw the patch on Grizz's vest, he knew his life was over. The bikers had not laid a hand on him, not yet. They had just dragged him out, tied him up, and let him listen to the arrival of his judgment. He was now weeping, snot and tears running down his face, a pathetic puddle of a man. The wall of bikers parted. Grizz and Preacher emerged from the center of the light. They were not angry. They were cold. They moved with the slow, deliberate pace of men who had absolute control. Grizz held something in his hand. Officer Riley, his hand shaking on the grip of his undrawn pistol, tried to assert himself. "Sir, I am ordering you to stand down. This is a police matter." Grizz did not even look at him. He continued, walking, his heavy boots crunching on the gravel, his eyes locked on the terrified cop. This was the inversion. The moment the entire town of Warren understood. The feared outlaws were not the threat. They were the shield. The monsters in leather were the only angels this town had. They had not come to cause chaos. They had come to restore order. They had done the job the police were too lazy to do. They had investigated the imagination of a small boy and found the rot at the heart of the town. They were not vigilantes. They were a righteous flood, washing away the filth that the system had allowed to fester. This is the moment of truth. The police are standing useless. The system, in the form of Principal Evans, is exposed as the true predator. The guardians are the men society told you to fear. If you believe real power should protect the innocent, not the predators, smash that like button. Your engagement proves people care more about justice than they do about politics. It sends a message that we are watching and we demand better. Grizz finally stopped, standing just inches from Officer Riley. The cop was a head shorter, 100 pounds lighter. He was trembling. Grizz slowly raised his hand. It was not a weapon. It was the key to the shipping container's padlock. He tossed it onto the hood of Riley's cruiser. The metal clanged loudly in the silence. "You're late, officer." Grizz's voice was a low rumble. "We found them." He pointed with his chin toward the blue steel box. 3 children from 3 different counties. Alive. The weight of those words hit Riley like a physical blow. 3. Alive. Marcus's story. The van. The policeman's face went from pale to sick. He understood what he had done. He understood his failure, his lazy, cynical dismissal of a child's plea. He was complicit. His inaction had almost cost 3 lives. He looked at the wall of bikers, at their impassive, accusing silence. They were not just containing the scene. They were bearing witness. They were a jury of 500 men, and their verdict on his failure was guilty. Preacher stepped forward, holding out a phone. It was playing a video, a full confession from a weeping Principal Evans, recorded 10 minutes ago. He detailed everything: the names, the dates, how he chose them, how he and Fitch operated. He had given it all up, not under threat of violence, but under the unbearable weight of 500 men staring at him in total, accusing silence. "You'll want this for your evidence," Preacher said, his voice dripping with contempt. "We did your job for you. Now go and get the children." Officer Riley's legs felt like lead as he walked toward the blue shipping container. The key felt heavy in his shaking hand, a small piece of metal that represented his colossal failure. He fumbled with the padlock, the click of it opening sounding like a gunshot in the silent, light-flooded yard. He and the other 2 officers pulled the heavy steel doors open. A blast of cold, stale air hit them, followed by the sight that would haunt their nightmares forever. 3 small children, huddled together on a pile of filthy blankets, their eyes wide and white with terror. They were alive. Rayleigh sank to his knees, the shame and relief a toxic, overwhelming cocktail. The arrest was a quiet, humiliating affair. The bikers parted their ranks just enough for the police to lead the weeping Principal Evans and the hollow-eyed Fitch to their cruisers. The clicks of the handcuffs were the only sounds. The entire town, now gathered behind the police barricades, filmed the scene on their phones. They were not just filming the criminals. They were filming the failure of their police department and the quiet, dignified power of the men who had done their job. The Iron Sentinels did not cheer. They did not jeer. They simply watched, their silence a more profound condemnation than any shout. The shock that rolled through Warren was a different kind of tremor. The news spread instantly. The monsters who had invaded their town had not come to destroy. They had come to save. They had found the rot that was living right under their noses. A rot personified by a trusted school principal. A rot that their own police force had been too lazy and too cynical to even look for. Every citizen who had locked their door, every person who had peered in fear from behind their curtains, now felt a cold, burning shame. They had judged the leather, and in doing so had become blind to the true evil. As the police cruisers pulled away, their sirens now silent, the 500 bikers did not disperse. The tension did not break. Grizz mounted his Harley, the heavy bike groaning. He looked at the crowd, then at the diner, his gaze sweeping the town until it settled on the alley where the boy had vanished. He knew his work was not done. The protocol was not just about punishment, it was about protection. He had one last debt to pay, not to the town, but to the small, terrified boy who had possessed the courage to trust a monster. He started his engine, a low, controlled rumble. One by one, 500 engines followed his lead. The sound was different now. It was not the thunder of war. It was the rumble of a procession, a deep, resonant honor guard. The river of steel and chrome turned, flowing out of the warehouse district and into the residential streets. They moved slowly, respectfully, past the diner, past the now darkened school, and into the poorest part of town. They were following a map Preacher had pulled up, a map leading to the 3rd-floor apartment of one Nana Rose. They were going to see the boy who had lit the fuse. Marcus and Nana Rose huddled inside their apartment, the roar of the bike sounding like it was coming from inside their living room. Nana Rose clutched her chest, praying. Marcus looked out the window, and his heart stopped. The street below was not a street. It was a sea of headlights, all pointed at their building. The bright orange eviction notice on their door seemed to glow in the reflected light. "They're here," Marcus whispered, not knowing if it was an execution or a rescue. Grizz dismounted, walked to their door, and tore the eviction notice from the wood with one gloved hand. He did not knock. He walked up the stairs, his boots heavy on the worn steps, Preacher following him. He gently pushed open the unlocked door. Marcus stood in the center of the tiny, cold room, shielding his grandmother with his small body. Grizz stopped. He looked at the bare cupboards, the hissing oxygen tank, the pile of blankets. He looked at Marcus. He took off his sunglasses. His eyes were not hard. They were filled with a profound, weary sadness. He held out the crumpled eviction notice. "This is not your burden anymore, son," he said. The next morning, the town of Warren awoke to a new sound. It was not engines. It was the sound of hammers, saws, and work. The Iron Sentinels had not left. They had become a construction crew, an army of skilled labor. They were fixing the roof on Nana Rose's building. They were installing new windows. They were rewiring the faulty electricity. Men who had stormed beaches in foreign wars were now painting walls and fixing plumbing. Their movements efficient, practiced, and tireless. They were rebuilding what the world had allowed to decay. A separate group of bikers, led by Preacher, made a trip to the local grocery distributor. They did not buy a few bags. They bought pallets. They returned with 2 pickup trucks loaded with food, with medical supplies, with new blankets, with a new, quiet oxygen concentrator. They stocked Nana Rose's pantry and freezer until they were overflowing. They filled her prescription for 6 months. They paid her electricity bill for a year. They did it all in silence, a blur of leather and efficiency, asking for nothing, explaining nothing. When the work was done, Grizz called Marcus outside. The entire club, 500 men, was assembled in the street. They formed 2 lines, a gauntlet of honor. Grizzy stood at the end, holding a new, child-sized leather vest. It was a cut just like theirs, and on the back was a single patch, the Iron Sentinel's broken shield emblem. "We don't give these out." Grizz's voice was thick. "We earned them. You showed us what courage looks like. You are not alone. You are family. You are a sentinel." He placed the heavy vest on Marcus's small shoulders. Courage is not the absence of fear. Courage is being terrified, seeing that the system designed to protect you has failed, and having the guts to ask for help anyway. It is the wisdom to know that heroes do not always wear badges, and saviors do not always look like angels. Sometimes they look like the men you have been taught to fear. Marcus, draped in leather, finally understood. He was safe. The monsters who had haunted his town were gone, and the monsters who guarded his street were now his family. Share this video with someone who needs to. Remember that heroes still exist. They are not always clean-cut. They do not always follow the rules. They do not always wear capes. Sometimes they wear leather, and they ride for the ones the world has forgotten. They are the last line, the shield for the broken, and they will answer the call when no one else will.